Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight as Robert Mitchell adjusted his hard hat and wiped sweat from his brow. The July heat in Huntsville, Texas was unforgiving, especially for the demolition crew tasked with tearing down the abandoned east wing of Willow Creek Penitentiary. Built in 1892, the facility had housed some of the state's most notorious criminals until its closure in 1975. "Hey, Rob, we're ready to take down Cell Block D," called Frank Harding, the project foreman, a stocky man with calloused hands and 20 years of experience. Frank had seen his share of difficult demolitions, but something about this prison made his skin crawl. Robert nodded and made his way through the crumbling corridor. The prison had been emptied 3 years ago, yet the walls seemed to hold on to the desperation of the men who had been caged here. Graffiti marked the chipped paint, crude drawings, names, and tallies counting days that stretched into years. "This place gives me the creeps," muttered Carlos, the youngest member of their crew, as he adjusted the settings on the excavator. "My uncle was a guard here back in the 60s. Said they had more suicides in D Block than anywhere else." Robert rolled his eyes. "Every old building has stories, kid. Focus on the job." As the hydraulic arm of the excavator rose, poised to strike the first blow against the weathered brick wall, a sound echoed through the abandoned corridor, the unmistakable metallic clang of a cell door slamming shut. The three men froze. "What the hell was that?" Carlos whispered, his hand hovering over the controls. "Probably just metal settling," Frank replied, though uncertainty crept into his voice. "This place has been baking in the sun all day." Robert frowned. "I'll check it out. We need to make sure no one's wandered in." The corridor stretched before him, empty and silent. His footsteps echoed against the concrete floor as he made his way deeper into the cell block. The air grew noticeably cooler as he advanced, raising goosebumps on his arms despite the summer heat. The cells stood open, their doors rusted in place, all except for one at the far end. Cell 213 was sealed shut, its iron door gleaming as if recently cleaned. "Hello," Robert called out, approaching cautiously. "Anyone in there?" No response came, but as he drew closer, Robert could swear he heard breathing shallow and ragged from within the darkened cell. A chill ran down his spine as he peered through the small barred window in the door. Empty. The cell contained nothing but a rusted bed frame and a toilet fixture stained with decades of use. Robert reached for the door handle, then hesitated. Something felt wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. The metal was ice cold to the touch, impossibly so given the Texas heat. He turned back toward the entrance where Frank and Carlos waited. "There's nothing here," he called. "Let's get back to—" The words died in his throat as a whisper rose from behind the cell door. Indistinct at first, then forming words he could almost understand. A name, perhaps. "Did you hear that?" he asked, turning back to the cell. The door to cell 213 now stood wide open. Robert felt his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't a superstitious man, but 30 years in construction had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct now screamed at him to leave. As he turned to walk away, the cell door slammed shut with such force that the entire corridor seemed to vibrate. No wind, no draft, no explanation. "Rob, everything okay?" Frank called from the entrance. Robert didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the small rectangular nameplate beside cell 213, its surface now clean of dust while everything around it remained covered in grime. A single name was etched into the metal: William Hendricks, 1944 to 1967. "We need to get out of here," Robert whispered. "Now." The Huntsville Public Library was quiet on Thursday afternoon when Sarah Chun settled at a microfiche reader. As the local newspaper's newest reporter, it's been assigned what seemed like a fluff piece as strange occurrences at the Willow Creek demolition site, but something about the construction workers' accounts had piqued her interest. Doors slamming in an abandoned prison, she muttered to herself as she threaded the film into the machine. Classic ghost story material. Sarah had graduated from journalism school just 6 months ago, and her editor's assignment came with a clear subtext: prove yourself or keep writing obituaries. Her father, a pragmatic electrical engineer, had always taught her to seek rational explanations. "There's no such thing as ghosts, Sir Bear," he'd say. "Just people's minds playing tricks." The microfiche word as she scrolled through. Editions of the Huntsville item from 1967. July August September. She paused on an article from September 4th. Inmate death at Willow Creek under investigation. Her eyes scanned the grainy text. William Hendricks, 23, was found dead in his cell yesterday morning. Preliminary reports suggest suicide, though fellow inmates claim Hendricks had been in good spirits. Hendricks was serving a 5-year sentence for armed robbery and was scheduled for parole consideration next month. Sarah wrote down the name and continued searching. 2 hours later, she had compiled a small but troubling collection of facts. William Hendricks had maintained his innocence throughout his incarceration. His parole hearing had been approaching, and most interestingly, 3 guards had been on duty the night he died, but reports conflicted about who had last checked his cell. "Excuse me," said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to find an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses and a tweed jacket despite the summer heat. "I couldn't help noticing your research," he said. "I'm Professor Alan Whitman. I taught criminal justice at Sam Houston State before I retired." "Sarah Chun, Huntsville item," she replied, shaking his hand. "I'm looking into the history of Willow Creek for an article." The professor's expression turned solemn. "Particularly William Hendricks, I see. You know about him?" Whitman nodded slowly. "I was part of a prison reform committee in the late 60s. Hendricks' case was ... troubling. The official report said suicide, but certain details never added up." Sarah leaned forward. "What kind of details?" "For one, the bruising patterns on his neck weren't consistent with hanging. For another, his personal effects included a letter to his mother, half-written, talking about his hopes for parole. Not typically the behavior of a suicidal man." The professor adjusted his glasses. "But what always struck me as most peculiar was how his cell door was found locked from the outside. If he had taken his own life, who locked the door?" A chill ran through Sarah despite the library's stuffy warmth. "The construction workers at the demolition site reported hearing cell doors slamming shut yesterday. Specifically cell 213. Professor Whitman's face paled. "That was Hendricks' cell." Sarah hesitated before asking her next question. "Professor, do you believe in ghosts?" "I believe in justice, Miss Chun," he replied carefully. "And sometimes justice has a long memory." As they spoke, the lights in the library flickered briefly. "There's something else," Whitman continued, lowering his voice. 2 of the guards on duty that night died under unusual circumstances within a year of Hendricks' death. One in a car accident where the brakes mysteriously failed, another from a fall down his basement stairs, and the 3rd guard, Thomas Mercer. Last I heard, he was still alive. Moved to a nursing home outside of town after suffering a stroke about 5 years ago. The professor wrote an address on a slip of paper and slid it across the table. "If you're serious about this story, you might want to speak with him." Sarah stared at the address, her reporter's instinct battling with growing unease. "Thank you, Professor." As she gathered her notes, the professor added one last comment. "Be careful. Miss Chun, some doors, once opened, are difficult to close again." Outside the library, Sarah checked her watch. The Oakwood Care Center was only 20 minutes away. She could make it before the end of visiting hours. What had begun as a simple human interest piece was quickly becoming something else entirely, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. But Sarah had never been one to leave a story half-finished. She started her car and headed north, the address clutched in her hand, unaware that a cold presence had settled in her back seat, invisible, watchful, and waiting. Oakwood Care Center smelled of antiseptic and overcooked vegetables. Sarah signed the visitor log at the front desk, claiming to be Thomas Mercer's niece. The tired receptionist barely glanced up before directing her to room 137. The hallway stretched before her, fluorescent lights humming overhead. Elderly residents sat in wheelchairs along the walls, some staring vacantly, others tracking her progress with curious eyes. A television blared a game show from the communal room, the audience's applause incongruously cheerful against the backdrop of medical equipment and decline. Room 137's door stood ajar. Sarah knocked gently before peering inside. Thomas Mercer sat by the window, his right side visibly weakened by stroke. At 78, his face was a map of deep wrinkles, but his left eye remained sharp and alert as it fixed on her. "Mr. Mercer? I'm Sarah Chun from the Huntsville item." His gaze hardened. "Not interested in subscriptions, actually. I'm a reporter." Sarah stepped into the room, closing the door partway. "I'm researching an article about Willow Creek Penitentiary, specifically an incident in 1967. The change in Mercer's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His hand began to tremble, rattling the water glass on his side table. "Get out," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Mr. Mercer, I just want to ask about William Hendricks." I said, "Get out." His voice rose to a shout, then broke into a fit of coughing. Sarah stepped forward, concerned, but froze when Mercer grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. "You don't understand," he wheezed, his roomy eye wide with fear. "He's still there, still watching, especially now that they're tearing it down." "Who's watching, Mr. Mercer?" "Hendricks." The name escaped like a curse. He wasn't supposed to die. He was just supposed to scare him, teach him to keep his mouth shut about what he saw. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. What did he see? Mercer released her wrist, his moment of agitation giving way to resignation. "Jenkins," he was head guard back, then had an arrangement with some inmates. Contraband, special privileges, all for a price. Hendricks stumbled on a delivery one night. Jenkins couldn't risk him talking, not with the reform committee nosing around. So what happened? We went to rough him up a bit, that's all. But Jenkins took it too far. Got his hands around the kid's neck and wouldn't let go. Mercer's voice dropped to a whisper. I can still hear the sound, like a pencil snapping. Sarah felt sick but pressed on. And then you covered it up. Made it look like suicide? Mercer nodded slowly. Jenkins had pictures of my kids. Said he'd make sure something happened to them if I talked. A tear rolled down his weathered cheek. I've lived with it ever since, but Hendricks, he never left. Started with little things, keys going missing, doors locking by themselves. Then Jenkins died in that car crash. Brakes cut clean through. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Outside, clouds obscured the sun, casting the room in shadow. Barrett was next, fell down his stairs. No witnesses. Mercer's voice shook. I've been waiting my turn for 50 years. Every night I hear cell doors slamming in my dreams. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Mr. Mercer, it's time for your medication. Sarah stood, tucking her notebook into her bag. Thank you for your time. As she turned to leave, Mercer called after her. They found something on Hendricks when they cleaned out his cell. A St. Christopher medal. His mother gave it to him. Jenkins took it, wore it like a trophy. After he died, his widow donated his things to the county museum. That medal should still be there. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked. Because maybe if someone knows the truth, if someone finds that medal, double quotes, his voice faltered. Maybe then he'll let me die in peace. As Sarah walked down the corridor, the overhead lights flickered, plunging the hallway into momentary darkness. When they came back on, she could have sworn she saw a figure standing at the far end, a young man in prison denim, watching her with hollow eyes. She blinked and the hallway was empty again. Outside, she sat in her car, hands trembling as she started the engine. The county museum would be closed by now, but it opened at 9 tomorrow morning. One more piece of the puzzle, one more stop before returning to the demolition site. In her rearview mirror, a shadow moved across the back seat. Sarah whipped around, heart pounding, but found only empty space and the inexplicable smell of stale cigarettes. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Walker County Historical Museum as Sarah signed the visitor log. The small building housed local artifacts dating back to the county's founding, though few tourists ventured beyond the main gallery featuring Civil War memorabilia. Can I help you find something specific? Asked the elderly docent, her volunteer badge identifying her as Eleanor. I'm researching items donated by the family of Thomas Jenkins, Sarah explained. He was a guard at Willow Creek in the 1960s. Eleanor's smile dimmed slightly. The Jenkins collection is in our law enforcement exhibit. Down the hall, last room on the left. The room was dimly lit to preserve the aging photographs and textiles. Glass cases displayed sheriff badges, old handcuffs, and sepia-toned pictures of stern-faced lawmen. In the far corner, a placard read, Thomas Jenkins Memorial Collection, donated 1968. Inside the case lay a guard's cap, a tarnished badge, a ring of heavy iron keys. And just as Mercer had described, a St. Christopher medal on a thin silver chain. The medal was small and worn, its face rubbed nearly smooth from years of handling. Unusual piece, that one, said Eleanor, who had followed Sarah into the room. Most of the Jenkins items are standard-issue prison guard equipment, but that medal was personal. Do you know anything about its history? Sarah asked. Eleanor adjusted her glasses. According to Mrs. Jenkins, her husband found it at the prison. She always thought it strange that he wore it, as he wasn't a particularly religious man. The elderly woman leaned closer, lowering her voice. Between us, Mrs. Jenkins once told me she was glad when he started wearing it, said it seemed to calm his temper. He'd been a violent man at home before that. Sarah studied the medal through the glass. Is there any way I could examine it more closely? For my article? The docent hesitated before responding. Normally we don't allow handling of the artifacts, but ... double quotes. She glanced around the empty museum. Mrs. Jenkins was a dear friend. If it's for historical research, I suppose I could make an exception. With white-gloved hands, Eleanor carefully unlocked the case and lifted out the medal, placing it on a felt cloth on the table. I'll give you a few minutes, she said, stepping back. Please don't remove your gloves. As soon as Sarah's fingers touched the medal, a jolt of cold shot up her arm. The room's temperature seemed to plummet, her breath suddenly visible in the air. Turning the medal over, she noticed something that wasn't visible through the display glass. A crude inscription scratched into the back. Wah. Innocent. The lights flickered overhead. Unusual inscription, Eleanor commented, rubbing her arms against the sudden chill. The heating must be acting up again. Sarah could barely focus on the woman's words. As she held the metal, a strange sensation washed over her, a flood of images and emotions not her own. A cell door viewed from inside, hands around a throat. The desperate knowledge of approaching death and the rage of injustice. She dropped the metal back onto the cloth, gasping. "Are you all right, dear?" Eleanor asked, concerned. "Fine," Sarah managed, though her voice shook. "Just reminded me of something." She pointed to the inscription. "Do you know what WASH might stand for?" The docent shook her head. "No idea." Museum records only noted his personal effect of Thomas Jenkins. Sarah knew better. William Hendricks. The man who died in cell 213. The man whose presence now seemed to fill the small museum room, watching and waiting. "Thank you for showing me," Sarah said, stepping back from the table. "It's been very helpful." As Eleanor returned the medal to the display case, Sarah noticed something strange. A small, wet spot on the felt cloth where the medal had been, as if someone had left a teardrop behind. Outside the museum, Sarah sat in her car, her hands still trembling. The logical part of her brain, the part trained in journalism school to seek facts and verifications, struggled to explain what she had experienced. But another part, a deeper instinct, recognized the truth William Hendricks was trying to communicate, and the demolition of Willow Creek had somehow strengthened his ability to do so. She started her car. Decision made. It was time to return to the prison, to cell block D, to the place where it all began. As she pulled away from the museum, she didn't notice the figure sitting in her back seat, a young man in prison denim, his neck bearing the dark bruises of strangulation, watching her with hollow eyes filled with 50 years of waiting. The demolition site was quiet when Sarah arrived that afternoon. Chain-link fence surrounded the property, plastered with no trespassing signs. But the gate hung partially open, a stroke of luck she hadn't counted on. She parked her car on a side street and walked the perimeter. Journalist badge prominently displayed in case anyone questioned her presence. The demolition crew's equipment stood idle. According to the foreman she'd interviewed by phone that morning, work had been suspended pending an equipment safety review. Frank Harding hadn't elaborated, but his voice had carried an edge of fear that told Sarah more than his words. Whatever had happened in cell block D had spooked the entire crew. Finding a gap in the fence, Sarah slipped through, her sneakers crunching on gravel and broken glass. The prison loomed before her, a massive Victorian structure of red brick and iron, its windows like hollow eyes staring down at her. The east wing, where cell block D was located, remained partially intact, though scaffolding and demolition equipment surrounded it like predators closing in for the kill. "This is crazy," she muttered to herself, clutching her backpack tighter. Inside was her camera, a digital recorder, a flashlight, and on an impulse she couldn't quite explain, a small crucifix her grandmother had given her years ago. The main entrance was locked, but a service door at the side hung ajar. Sarah hesitated only briefly before entering, the smell of dust, mold, and something indefinably older hitting her immediately. She flicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. Graffiti covered the walls of the entrance corridor, not the crude tags of modern vandals, but the desperate markings of men who had lived and died here. Names, dates, prayers, curses. Sarah ran her fingers over a set of tally marks that stretched nearly 6 feet across. How many days of a man's life did they represent? Following the blueprints she had studied at the library, Sarah made her way deeper into the prison. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, the sound echoing through empty corridors. Occasionally metal creaked and settled, making her jump. Cell block D was at the easternmost point of the building. As she approached, the temperature noticeably dropped. Her breath fogged in the air, though outside July heat had pushed the thermometer past 90 degrees. The cell block opened before her, a long corridor with cells on both sides, their doors standing open like rows of gaping mouths. Sunlight filtered through dust-caked windows high above, casting strange, shifting patterns on the concrete floor. "Hello?" Sarah called out, immediately regretting the sound of her voice echoing through the empty space. "Is anyone here?" Only silence answered, but as she advanced down the corridor, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of dozens of invisible eyes following her progress from within the empty cells. At the far end stood cell 213. Unlike the others, its door was closed, the metal gleaming as if recently cleaned and oiled. The nameplate beside it shone in the beam of her flashlight. William Hendricks. 1944. 1967. Sarah lifted her camera and took several photographs, the flash momentarily illuminating the corridor in stark white light. She reached for the cell door handle, then hesitated, remembering Robert Mitchell's account of the ice-cold metal. Instead, she peered through the small barred window in the door. The cell appeared empty, just a rusted bed frame bolted to the wall and a stained toilet fixture. "William Hendricks?" she called, feeling foolish yet compelled. "I know what happened to you. I know about Jenkins and Mercer and what they did." The air grew colder still. Sarah's digital recorder, which she had set to record upon entering the prison, emitted a high-pitched squeal of feedback that made her wince. "I found your medal," she continued. "I saw what you scratched into it. Innocent. You were going to tell the Reform Committee about the corruption, weren't you? About Jenkins' smuggling operation." A sound came from behind the door, not quite a voice, but a sort of rattling exhale, like someone struggling to breathe. "They're demolishing this place," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever is keeping you here will be gone soon. But before that happens, I want to tell your story. The true story." The metal door suddenly vibrated beneath her hand, a low hum that she felt in her bones more than heard. The temperature plummeted further, frost forming on the concrete walls around her. Sarah's recorder emitted another squeal, then fell silent. When she checked it, the screen had gone black, the battery drained despite being fully charged that morning. A whisper rose from behind the door, so faint she had to press her ear against the cold metal to hear it. Truth. The single word sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the freezing air. "Yes," she answered. "The truth. That's what I want to." The cell door slammed open with such force that Sarah stumbled backward, nearly falling. The empty cell was now filled with a swirling darkness, deeper and more absolute than the mere absence of light. Within that darkness, something moved, a figure taking shape, its edges blurred and shifting but unmistakably human. Sarah raised her camera with trembling hands and took a photograph. The flash illuminated the cell for a split second, revealing nothing but empty space yet when she checked the camera's display. The image showed a young man standing in the center of the cell, his prison uniform neat, his eyes fierce with a determination that transcended death. Around his neck, dark bruises told the story that history had tried to erase. "William," Sarah whispered, lowering the camera. "I'll tell your story. I promise." The figure seemed to nod, then raised one hand, pointing not at Sarah but past her, down the corridor toward the main part of the prison. Sarah turned, following the direction of his gesture, and felt her blood run cold. At the far end of the corridor stood another figure, older, heavier, dressed in a guard's uniform. Even at this distance, she could see the gleam of a St. Christopher medal on his chest. Thomas Jenkins. 50 years dead, but somehow present, his face contorted with the same rage that had ended William Hendricks' life. And behind him, more shadows gathered, the accumulated darkness of all the injustices this place had witnessed. Sarah stood frozen between them, a living woman caught between two dead men and the unfinished business that bound them to this crumbling prison. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension as a new sound rose, the metallic clang of cell doors slamming shut one after another, moving toward her like a wave. The corridor exploded into chaos. Cell doors slammed in rapid succession, creating a cacophony that reverberated through the abandoned prison. Papers and debris swirled in a sudden windstorm that seemed to emanate from nowhere, whipping Sarah's hair across her face as she backed against the wall. The temperature fluctuated wildly, one moment freezing cold, the next hot as a furnace. Her camera's display flickered with static before going dark, and somewhere in the distance an alarm began to wail, an impossibility in a building without power. At one end of the corridor stood the translucent figure of William Hendricks, his form occasionally solidifying enough to reveal the details of his young face, determined, angry but with an undercurrent of fear. At the other end, the shadow of Thomas Jenkins grew more substantial with each passing second, his heavy footsteps echoing on the concrete despite the impossibility of such a sound. "This isn't happening," Sarah whispered, her journalist's mind struggling to rationalize what she was witnessing. "This can't be real." But the cold spot moving past her left arm felt real enough, as did the sudden smell of tobacco and cheap aftershave that accompanied Jenkins' approach. The metal on his chest gleamed with an unnatural light, seeming to pulse in rhythm with the slamming doors. "You should not have come here, girl," Jenkins' voice rasped, the sound seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "This ain't your business." "She knows," came another voice, younger, clearer, from the direction of cell 213. Hendricks' form flickered like a malfunctioning television signal. "She knows what you did." Jenkins laughed, a hollow sound that echoed unnaturally. "And who's going to believe her ghost stories? The ravings of a stroke-addled old man?" The former guard took another step forward. "This place has kept its secrets for 50 years. It'll keep them 50 more. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering in her chest. This defied everything she believed about reality, about the natural order of things, yet she couldn't deny the evidence of her senses. "The truth matters," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "William Hendricks was murdered to cover up corruption. That's not a ghost story, that's a fact I can prove." Jenkins' form wavered, his face contorting with rage. You think anyone cares about what happened to one inmate 50 years ago? He was nothing. A thief who got what was coming to him. I was innocent. Hendricks' voice cut through the corridor. The store owner recanted his identification. My lawyer had filed the appeal. I would have been free in 3 months. You saw what you weren't supposed to see, Jenkins snarled. You were going to talk. Yes, Sarah interjected, a journalist even in the face of the impossible. What exactly did he see, Jenkins? What were you bringing into the prison? Drugs? Weapons? The ghost's attention snapped to her, his eyes burning with 50-year-old hatred. Clever girl. Too clever for your own good. The air around Jenkins began to darken and swirl, the shadow extending toward Sarah like reaching fingers. The temperature plummeted again, frost forming on the walls around her. You died of a car accident, Sarah said, backing away. Brake lines cut. Did Hendricks do that from beyond the grave, or was it one of your partners tying up loose ends? Jenkins' form flickered violently. Shut your mouth. The county museum has your medal, the one you took from him. Sarah continued, fighting through her fear. His mother's gift. Did you think wearing it would protect you from him? From what you've done? A howl of rage erupted from Jenkins as the darkness around him coalesced, surging forward like a wave. Sarah threw her arms up instinctively, but the cold mass passed through her, leaving her gasping for breath as icy tendrils seemed to reach into her very soul. She collapsed to her knees, shivering uncontrollably. The crucifix from her backpack tumbled out onto the floor, its silver surface catching what little light remained in the corridor. Jenkins loomed over her, his form shifting between solid and vapor. You'll join him in cell 213. Another suicide. So sad. So preventable. Sarah's fingers closed around the crucifix. The metal warmed despite the freezing air. You're dead, she managed through chattering teeth. You have no power here. I have the power given to me by this place, Jenkins replied, his voice reverberating through the corridor. By the fear and pain of every man who suffered here. By the guilt of those who watched and did nothing. From the other end of the corridor. William Hendricks moved forward, his form becoming more defined with each step. Not anymore. A new sound rose, voices, dozens of them, whispering from within the open cells. As Sarah watched in disbelief, more translucent figures emerged, inmates in various styles of prison uniforms spanning decades, their faces bearing the marks of their final moments. Some showed bruises like Hendricks, others cuts or burns or the vacant stares of those who had given up hope. What is this? Jenkins growled, his confidence faltering for the first time. Justice, Hendricks replied simply. You're not the only one with unfinished business, Jenkins. The ghosts moved forward in eerie unison surrounding the former guard. Where their forms overlapped, they seemed to gain substance, becoming more visible, more present. Jenkins backed away, his face contorted with an emotion Sarah hadn't expected to see. Stay back, he shouted, his voice cracking. I was just doing my job, your job. One of the ghosts stepped forward, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a gash across his forehead. Was it your job to beat me to death for reporting your smuggling operation? Was it your job to falsify the medical records, claim I had a heart attack? Another ghost joined him, a young black man with burn marks on his arms. Was it your job to lock me in the boiler room for talking to the reform committee? To tell the investigators I must have gotten lost, fallen asleep too close to the pipes? One by one they stepped forward, each with a story, each with wounds that told of cruelty masked as discipline, of deaths covered up as accidents or suicides. Jenkins' form began to flicker more rapidly, fragments of his image dispersing like smoke in a strong wind. No, he muttered. No, this isn't right. This isn't how it's supposed to be. The St. Christopher medal on his chest glowed brighter, seeming to anchor his fading form to this reality. Hendricks' eyes fixed on it, recognition and rage flashing across his face. That's mine, he said softly. My mother gave me that before she died. She said it would protect me. Jenkins clutched at the medal. It's mine now. Everything in this prison was mine. Not anymore, Hendricks replied, stepping forward. Not ever again. Sarah watched, transfixed, as Hendricks reached out toward Jenkins's chest. The former guard tried to retreat, but the wall of spectral inmates behind him prevented escape. Hendricks' hand passed through Jenkins' form, closing around the metal. A blinding flash of light erupted from the point of contact, accompanied by a sound like glass shattering on concrete. Sarah shielded her eyes, momentarily blinded. When she lowered her arm, Jenkins was gone. Where he had stood lay the ST. Christopher Meadow, its chain broken, its surface gleaming in the dim light as if brand new. The other ghosts began to fade, their forms becoming transparent, then vanishing altogether. The unnatural cold dissipated, replaced by the normal stuffiness of the abandoned building. Only Hendricks remained, standing in the center of the corridor, looking down at the metal on the floor. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hendricks looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment he appeared almost solid, a young man of 23, robbed of his future, but not in the end of justice. "Tell my story," he said simply. "Tell all of them." Sarah nodded, a journalist's promise. "I will." Hendricks smiled faintly, then looked toward the ceiling where sunlight streamed through dusty windows. His form began to dissolve, particles of light rising upward like dust motes caught in a sunbeam. Within moments he was gone, leaving Sarah alone in the empty corridor of cell block D. She knelt and picked up the St. Christopher medal, half expecting it to be ice-cold or supernaturally warm. It felt like ordinary metal in her palm, simple object that had witnessed extraordinary events. As she stood, Sarah noticed that the nameplate beside cell 213 had changed. The dates now read, William Hendricks, 1944 to 1967. Innocent. The Huntsville Items offices hummed with activity as Sarah hunched over her desk, surrounded by stacks of photocopied records, interview transcripts, and historical documents. 3 days had passed since her experience at Willow Creek, and she had barely slept, driven by a combination of journalistic fervor and the weight of her promise to Hendricks. "Chun, my office now," called Marcus Benson, the paper's editor-in-chief. Sarah gathered her notes and followed him into the glass-walled room overlooking the newsroom. Benson, a veteran journalist with 30 years of experience and the battle scars to prove it, gestured for her to close the door. "So," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you've been working on this demolition story for almost a week. Please tell me you've got something more substantial than ghost stories." Sarah placed her research on his desk. "I've got a lot more, actually. This isn't just about strange occurrences at the demolition site. It's about a systematic pattern of abuse and cover-ups at Willow Creek spanning decades." Benson raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched on his weathered face. "That's a big claim. I've got the evidence to back it up." Sarah laid out documents one by one. Death certificates for 12 inmates between 1960 and 1972, all ruled suicides or accidents. All occurred during shifts supervised by Thomas Jenkins or his close associates. That could be coincidence. I also have testimony from Thomas Mercer, one of the guards involved, confirming that William Hendricks was murdered to cover up a smuggling operation. She placed the transcript of her nursing home interview on top of the pile, and I've cross-referenced his account with prison records that show unusual patterns of contraband discoveries and disciplinary actions. Benson picked up the transcript, scanning it with practiced efficiency. "Mercer's a stroke victim. Defense attorneys would tear his testimony apart. That's why I didn't stop there." Sarah pulled out more documents. "I tracked down family members of 3 other inmates who died under suspicious circumstances. They all reported receiving letters shortly before their loved ones' deaths, mentioning plans to speak with prison reform, advocates about conditions inside." Benson's expression shifted subtly, the look of a journalist recognizing a legitimate lead. "There's more," Sarah continued. "The county coroner from 1967, Dr. Alan Whitman, kept personal notes separate from his official reports. His grandson provided these." She placed photocopied pages of handwritten notes on the desk. They detail his suspicions about Hendricks's death, specifically noting that the bruising patterns were inconsistent with suicide by hanging. Why didn't he come forward? According to his grandson, he tried. His concerns were dismissed by the sheriff, who, it turns out, was Jenkins' brother-in-law. Benson leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "What about physical evidence? Anything that would hold up today?" Sarah hesitated. How could she explain the ST? Christopher Medell now sitting in an evidence bag at the police station. How could she describe what she had witnessed in cell block D without sounding delusional? The county museum had items donated by Jenkins' widow after his death, including personal effects taken from inmates. One was a St. Christopher medal that belonged to William Hendricks. She chose her words carefully. There's an inscription on the back. Wah, innocent. I've convinced the police to test it for DNA that might connect it to Hendricks, and the museum just handed over a historical artifact? Not exactly. The medal was relocated to the demolition site. I found it there during my investigation. Benson's eyes narrowed. Chun, if you tampered with evidence I didn't, I reported it to Detective Rodriguez immediately. This at least was true. Sarah had called the police from her car, her hands still shaking from her experience. He's reopened the investigation into Hendricks' death. Benson studied her for a long moment. There's something you're not telling me. Sarah met his gaze steadily. There are aspects of this story that would strain credibility if included in the article. I'm focusing on the provable facts, the corruption, the cover-ups, the long-delayed justice for these men. The mysterious slamming doors at the demolition site? I'm treating those as what initially drew attention to the location, nothing more. Benson nodded slowly. Smart. Stick to what you can prove. He gathered the documents, examining them with growing interest. This could be significant, Chun, not just locally but statewide. A pattern of institutional abuse and corruption that went unchecked for decades, with consequences that continue today, Sarah added. 3 current corrections officers at Huntsville State Penitentiary are sons or nephews of guards implicated in the Willow Creek incidents. The current warden served under one of them early in his career. Benson whistled softly. You're not just poking a bear, you're walking into a den of them. These men deserve justice, Sarah said firmly. Even if it's decades overdue, justice is for the courts. Our job is truth. Benson handed the documents back to her. Finish the article. Focus on the facts, the paper trail, the testimonies. Leave out anything that can't be independently verified. He paused, his expression softening slightly, and watched her back. Stories like this make powerful enemies. Sarah nodded, gathering her research. As she turned to leave, Benson added one last comment. Chun, good work. This is real journalism. Back at her desk, Sarah opened her laptop and began to write, the words flowing easily after days of investigation. She crafted a narrative of corruption and cover-ups, of power abused and lives destroyed, all supported by documented evidence and first-hand accounts. What she could not include, were the ghostly figures in Cell Block D, the confrontation between Hendricks and Jenkins, or the inexplicable events she had witnessed. Those memories belonged to her alone, a secret truth behind the public one. As evening fell and the newsroom emptied, Sarah continued writing, driven by a sense of purpose that transcended mere professional ambition. Outside, storm clouds gathered, occasional flashes of lightning illuminating her workspace. In her purse, her phone buzzed with an incoming text. Detective Rodriguez, DNA results back. Metal shows genetic material consistent with sample from Hendricks's family. Case officially reopened. Sarah smiled faintly. The wheels of justice were finally turning. She didn't notice the brief flicker of the overhead lights, or the momentary reflection in her computer screen, young man in prison denim, watching over her shoulder with approval in his eyes. The Huntsville Item's front page on Monday morning carried the headline, Death Behind Bars. Decades of abuse uncovered at Willow Creek. Sarah's byline sat prominently beneath it, her first front-page story after 6 months at the paper. By noon, the article had been picked up by wire services and was appearing on news websites across the state. By evening, a national news network had dispatched a correspondent to Huntsville, and the governor's office had issued a statement promising a full investigation. Sarah watched the cascade of events with a mixture of professional pride and personal unease. She had told the truth, or at least, the part of the truth that could be documented and verified. But the complete truth remained locked within her, a secret she could share with no one. In her apartment that evening, she spread her research across her dining table, reviewing information that hadn't made it into the published article. The official investigation would need everything she had gathered, but there were still gaps in the timeline, questions without answers. A knock at her door startled her from her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw Detective Rodriguez standing in the hallway, his expression grim. "Miss Chun," he said when she opened the door. "May I come in?" Sarah stepped aside, noting the manila folder in his hand. "Has something happened?" Rodriguez surveyed the documents on her table before answering. "You've stirred up quite a hornet's nest with your article. The department's received calls from the Texas Rangers, the State Attorney General's office, and 3 different FBI divisions. Is that a problem?" "For some people, yes." Rodriguez placed his folder on the table. "I've been ordered to suspend my investigation pending the arrival of a task force from Austin." Sarah frowned. "They're shutting you down?" "Officially, they're centralizing the investigative effort. Unofficially, double quotes," he shrugged. "There are people in positions of power who aren't happy about old graves being dug up, literally and figuratively." "So why are you here?" Rodriguez opened the folder, revealing photographs of an elderly man in a wheelchair. Thomas Mercer. Mr. Mercer was found dead in his room at Oakwood Care Center this morning. The preliminary ruling is natural causes. Sarah felt a chill run through her. "But you don't think it was natural?" His nurse reported that he had a visitor yesterday evening, a man claiming to be his nephew. Rodriguez produced another photograph, a still from a security camera showing a tall man in his 50s, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap. Mercer had no nephews. "Who is he?" "James Holloway, son of Richard Holloway, who served as a guard at Willow Creek from 1965 to 1970. Rodriguez's expression hardened. "Currently employed as a captain at Huntsville State Penitentiary. Sarah sank into a chair. The implication's clear. They're cleaning up loose ends. That's my theory. Can't prove it, though. No signs of foul play, and Mercer was already in poor health. Rodriguez closed the folder. But I wanted you to know, and to warn you to be careful. You think I might be in danger? You've exposed a conspiracy that's been successfully hidden for half a century, Miss Chun. People have died for less. He handed her a business card. My personal number. Call any time, day or night, if something doesn't feel right. After Rodriguez left, Sarah double-checked her locks and drew the curtains. The excitement of breaking a major story had been replaced by a creeping sense of vulnerability. She was a journalist who had done her job, but she had also become part of a story that wasn't yet finished. Her phone rang, an unknown number. Hello, she answered cautiously. Sarah Chun? The voice was female, elderly, with a slight tremor. Speaking. Who is this? My name is Margaret Hendricks Wilson. William Hendricks was my brother. Sarah sat up straighter. Mrs. Wilson, I've been hoping to speak with you. I've read your article online. A neighbor showed it to me. The woman's voice broke slightly. All these years I knew Billy didn't kill himself. He had too much to live for. I'm so sorry for your loss, Sarah said, the inadequacy of the words striking her even as she spoke them. They told us it was suicide. Showed us papers, official reports. Made us feel like we were crazy for questioning it. A pause, then Billy wrote to me 2 weeks before he died. Said he had evidence of something bad happening at the prison. That he was going to tell the right people once he got out. He was murdered for trying to expose corruption, Sarah confirmed gently. I want to thank you for finding the truth, for telling his story. Margaret's voice strengthened with resolve. But there's something else. Something I've kept all these years. Sarah felt a familiar prickle of journalistic instinct. What is it? Letters. From Billy and from other inmates after he died. Letters the prison officials didn't know about, smuggled out by a sympathetic guard. Margaret paused. They named names. Miss Chun. Guards, administrators, even judges who were part of the corruption. Sarah's heart raced. Mrs. Wilson, these could be crucial to the investigation. Would you be willing to share them? That's why I'm calling. But I don't trust the mail, and I'm too old to travel to Huntsville. I can come to you, Sarah offered immediately. Where are you located, Austin? About 3 hours from you. The woman provided an address. Can you come tomorrow? I'll be there. After hanging up, Sarah immediately called Detective Rodriguez and left a message explaining the development. Then she began packing an overnight bag, planning to leave at first light. As she moved about her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Twice she turned suddenly, expecting to find someone behind her, but the rooms remained empty. Yet the air felt different, charged somehow, as if poised on the edge of something momentous. I'm keeping my promise, she said aloud to the empty room. I'm telling your story, William. All of it. From the corner of her eye, she caught a flicker of movement near her research table. When she turned, the papers had been disturbed, though no window was open to provide a draft. One document lay separated from the others, a photocopy of William Hendricks's prison intake form, his young face staring out from a 50-year-old mugshot. Sarah approached slowly, her journalistic skepticism battling with what she had experienced at Willow Creek. She picked up the photograph, studying the face of the man whose cause she had championed. Are you here? She asked softly. The lights in the apartment flickered once, briefly. Sarah nodded, accepting the response without fully understanding it. We're not finished yet, but we're getting closer. Outside, thunder rumbled as the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows as Sarah continued her preparations, moving with renewed purpose. The dead had waited 50 years for justice. She would not fail them now. Dawn broke over eastern Texas as Sarah's car cut through the morning mist on Highway 290. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a freshly washed landscape and a sky of perfect blue. Under different circumstances, she might have appreciated the beauty of the pine forest and rolling hills, but her mind remained fixed on the meeting ahead and the documents that might finally complete the puzzle. She reached Austin by mid-morning, navigating to a modest home in a quiet neighborhood of ranch-style houses and mature oak trees. Margaret Hendricks Wilson answered the door herself, a small woman in her 70s with snow-white hair and eyes that carried the same determined look Sarah had seen in her brother's prison photograph. Miss Chun, she said, extending a hand. Thank you for coming. The living room was neat and modest, filled with family photographs spanning decades. Sarah noticed immediately a framed picture of a young man in an army uniform, William Hendricks, before his arrest. His expression serious but hopeful. Billy was a good boy, Margaret said, following Sarah's gaze. Got in with the wrong crowd after coming back from Vietnam. Made some mistakes. But he was turning his life around in prison. Got his GED. Was taking college correspondence courses. She moved to a roll-top desk in the corner and unlocked it with a small key kept on a chain around her neck. I've kept these safe for 50 years. Waited for the right time, the right person to share them with. From a hidden compartment, she withdrew a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with faded ribbon. These are Billy's letters to me, from his time at Willow Creek. Next came a larger manila envelope, and these came after his death. 7 letters from different inmates, smuggled out by a guard named Peterson who believed Billy had been murdered. Peterson? Sarah repeated. I haven't come across that name in my research. He left the prison system shortly after Billy died. Moved to Oklahoma, I believe. Margaret handed both bundles to Sarah. He risked his job, maybe his life, to get these out. Sarah accepted the letters with a sense of reverence. May I? Margaret nodded, settling into an armchair as Sarah carefully untied the ribbon on the first bundle. The letters were written in a neat, precise hand, William Hendricks' thoughts and experiences preserved in fading ink on prison-issued stationery. She read through them chronologically, noting the evolution in his tone. Early letters focused on daily life, his educational pursuits, and hopes for parole. But the final 3, written in the weeks before his death, contained veiled references to troubling observations. The night managers are running a side business, he wrote in one. Packages coming in that don't go through inspection. Jay says it's mostly cigarettes and liquor. But I saw white powder changing hands last night. In the last letter, dated just 3 days before his death, Reform Committee visiting next month. Thinking I should tell them what I've seen. Dangerous, but it's the right thing to do. Don't worry, Cess. I'll be careful. Sarah looked up at Margaret, who was watching her with tear-filled eyes. He knew the risks. Billy always had a strong sense of right and wrong, even as a child. Margaret smiled sadly. Now the other ones. Those came spaced out over about 6 months after Billy died. The inmate letters were more crudely written but consistent in their accounts. They described a smuggling operation involving at least 4 guards, with Thomas Jenkins as the ringleader. Contraband ranged from cigarettes and alcohol to narcotics and weapons. Inmates who cooperated received privileges and protection. Those who threatened to expose the operation faced consequences ranging from planted contraband and extended sentences to accidents. One letter, signed only with the initial D, provided the most damning evidence. Hendricks was killed because he saw Jenkins and Warden Collins with the shipment from Mexico. Collins panicked when he heard Hendricks was planning to talk to the Reform Committee, gave Jenkins the order to shut him up. Sarah looked up sharply. Warden Collins? The corruption went all the way to the top? Margaret nodded grimly. Robert Collins. He went on to become director of the entire state prison system in the 70s. His son is a state senator now. The implications were staggering. If Collins had been involved, the cover-up would have had institutional backing at the highest levels. And if his son was now in a position of political power. Mrs. Wilson, these letters are explosive. They implicate people who are still influential in Texas today. Sarah carefully returned the letters to their envelopes. Would you be willing to let me take these to the authorities? To the task force investigating Willow Creek? That's why I kept them all these years. I was waiting for someone I could trust to do the right thing. Margaret's expression hardened with determination. Billy deserves justice, no matter how long it takes or who gets hurt in the process. Sarah placed the letters in her bag, then hesitated. There's something else I want to tell you. Something I didn't include in my article because I couldn't verify it journalistically. Margaret leaned forward, curiosity in her eyes. I believe your brother's spirit remained at Willow Creek. That he's been trying to tell his story. To find justice. Sarah held her breath, waiting for the skepticism or concern that typically greeted such statements. Instead, Margaret smiled gently. I know. You know? Billy's been visiting me for years. Nothing dramatic, just small things. The scent of his aftershave on his birthday, his favorite mug moving from the cabinet to the counter, the porch swing moving on still nights. She touched a locket at her neck. I've felt him watching over me. Sarah felt a wave of relief at being believed, at not having to hide this part of her experience. At the prison, I saw him, spoke with him. He led me to evidence, to witnesses. He wanted the truth to come out. That sounds like Billy. He always was stubborn. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. Do you think he'll find peace now? Move on? I don't know, Sarah answered honestly. But I think he's closer than he's been in 50 years. As they spoke, a shaft of sunlight broke through the window, illuminating the photograph of William Hendricks in his army uniform. For a moment brief enough that she might have imagined it, Sarah thought she saw the image smile. She spent another hour with Margaret. gathering additional context and family history to complete her understanding of William Hendricks the person, not just the victim. As she prepared to leave, Margaret pressed a small object into her hand, a replica of the St. Christopher medal. "I bought this after Billy died. Identical to the one our mother gave him." The elderly woman closed Sarah's fingers around it. "For protection on your journey. I think you might need it more than I do now." Driving back to Huntsville, Sarah called Detective Rodriguez to update him on the letters. His response was cautious but determined. "Senator Collins isn't going to like this. He's already been making calls, trying to control the investigation." The detective's voice carried the weariness of a man fighting against powerful opposition. "But the FBI's public corruption unit is taking the lead now. These letters could break the case wide open." "I'll bring them directly to you when I get back," Sarah promised. As she drove, the setting sun cast long shadows across the highway. In her rearview mirror, the empty backseat occasionally seemed to shimmer, as if occupied by an unseen passenger accompanying her on the journey back to Huntsville, back to where it all began and where it would finally end. The Walker County Courthouse stood imposing against the autumn sky, its limestone facade gleaming in the October sunlight. 3 months had passed since Sarah's article had broken the Willow Creek story, setting in motion a chain of events that had rocked the Texas criminal justice system to its core. Today marked the culmination of those events, a special grand jury hearing to consider indictments against surviving participants in the half-century-old conspiracy. Sarah sat in the press gallery, notebook in hand, watching as the key players assembled for the day's proceedings. FBI Special Agent Diana Oakes, who had led the federal investigation, conferred quietly with the special prosecutor. Detective Rodriguez, now part of the Joint Task Force, nodded to Sarah from across the room. And in the public seating area, Margaret Hendricks Wilson sat straight-backed and dignified, her white hair luminous under the fluorescent lights. The doors at the rear of the courtroom opened, and heads turned as the final witnesses arrived, 3 elderly men in wheelchairs, former inmates of Willow Creek who had survived to tell their stories. Their testimony, along with the letters Margaret had preserved and the physical evidence recovered from the partially demolished prison, had formed the backbone of the case. Sarah's role had evolved from journalist to participant as the investigation progressed. She had provided statements, turned over evidence, and testified before the grand jury about her discoveries. Her follow-up articles had tracked the widening scandal, reporting on each new revelation with the same meticulous attention to fact that had characterized her initial story. Senator James Collins had resigned 2 weeks after the investigation implicated his father. 2 current prison administrators with family connections to Willow Creek had been suspended pending the outcome of today's hearing. The ripple effects continued to spread through the system, exposing decades of institutional corruption and abuse. As the proceedings began, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her here. What had started as a simple human interest piece about strange occurrences at a demolition site had become the defining story of her career and, perhaps, of her life. Her thoughts were interrupted as the special prosecutor approached the bench. "Your Honor, before we begin, I'd like to inform the court that we've reached a cooperation agreement with Mr. James Holloway." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Holloway, the prison captain who had visited Thomas Mercer before his death, had been a key target of the investigation. "Mr. Holloway has provided substantial information regarding the ongoing criminal enterprise that originated at Willow Creek and continued within the current prison system," the prosecutor continued. "His testimony has been instrumental in identifying additional conspirators." The judge nodded. "Very well. Let's proceed." For the next 3 hours, Sarah listened as the prosecutor laid out the case against 7 living defendants and posthumously implicated 12 others, including Thomas Jenkins and Warden Robert Collins. The charges ranged from murder and conspiracy to obstruction of justice and racketeering under the RICO Act. During a brief recess, Detective Rodriguez approached Sarah in the hallway. "You should be proud," he said quietly. "None of this would have happened without you." Sarah shook her head. "I just told the story. The evidence was always there, waiting to be found by someone willing to listen to a ghost." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Their shared secret had become a tentative bond between them over the months of investigation. "I've never claimed that in any official capacity," Sarah reminded him with a small smile. "No, but we both know." The detective glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. "The demolition crew returned to Willow Creek last week. The foreman called me afterward, so the place feels different now. No more cold spots, no doors slamming on their own, really." Sarah felt a strange mix of emotions at this news. Rodriguez nodded. "They found something else, too. When they finally took down Cell Block D, there was writing on the wall behind where Cell 213 had been, carved into the concrete foundation, hidden all these years." "What did it say?" Innocent. Rodriguez met her eyes. Same handwriting as the metal inscription, according to the lab. Sarah touched the St. Christopher replica that now hung around her neck. He wanted to be remembered correctly. I think he got his wish. When the court reconvened, the special prosecutor requested formal indictments against all named conspirators. The grand jury would begin deliberations immediately, with results expected within days. As the session concluded, Sarah approached Margaret Wilson, who sat quietly absorbing the day's events. "How are you feeling?" Sarah asked, taking the seat beside her. Like a weight has been lifted. Margaret's eyes were clear and bright. "For 50 years I carried the knowledge that my brother was murdered, that the people responsible were living their lives without consequence. Now, finally, the truth is known. The indictments will almost certainly go through," Sarah assured her. "And the civil lawsuit your family filed has already forced the state to establish a victim compensation fund for all the Willow Creek families." Margaret reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. "Billy would be grateful for what you've done." "Have you felt his presence recently?" Sarah asked carefully. The older woman shook her head. "Not since the investigation began in earnest. I think perhaps he's found what he was waiting for." Outside the courthouse, autumn leaves skittered across the steps as Sarah and Margaret descended together. News cameras and reporters waited on the sidewalk, but they granted the women a respectful distance. "Will you come to dinner before you head back to Austin?" Sarah asked. "I'd like to hear more about William, the person he was before all this." Margaret smiled. "I'd like that. I have photographs, stories. He was more than just what happened to him at Willow Creek." As they walked toward the parking lot, Sarah noticed a figure standing beneath a massive oak tree across the street, a young man in a military uniform rather than prison denim, watching them with a peaceful expression. When she blinked, he was gone, leaving only dappled sunlight filtering through branches. "I think he's finally at rest," she said softly. Margaret followed her gaze to the empty spot beneath the tree. Somehow she seemed to understand. Justice was delayed but not denied. That matters. That evening, as they shared memories and built a bridge between past and present, Sarah realized that some stories never truly end. They simply transform, becoming part of a larger narrative that connects us across time. William Hendricks had been silenced in 1967, but his voice had finally been heard, his truth acknowledged. In her career as a journalist, Sarah would go on to uncover other injustices, to tell other stories that demanded to be told. But she never forgot her first major investigation or the unseen guide who had led her through it. Sometimes on quiet nights in the newspaper archives or walking through historic buildings, she would catch a glimpse of movement at the edge of her vision, feel a momentary chill in otherwise warm air, or hear the faint echo of a door closing in an empty corridor. And she would smile, knowing that some doors once opened never fully close again, and that sometimes the past reaches out to the present not to haunt it, but to heal it. In the end, the most important part of William Hendricks' story wasn't how he died, but that decades later someone finally listened when he tried to speak. The truth had waited patiently in the walls of Willow Creek Penitentiary, enduring until the right person came along to hear it. Justice, like the ghost of Cell 213, had proved more persistent than those who sought to lock it away.